what happens when we change people's hormones?
Yeah, right.
Our hormones, we have them for a reason. Like evolution by selection doesn't select for costly traits, and hormones are expensive. They're metabolically expensive. They make our brain reorganize themselves every month. None of that stuff would go on if it wasn't doing something to promote survival or reproduction. And so by eliminating that, by decreasing or sort of minimizing women's exposure to cyclicity in their hormonal profiles, you're essentially changing a lot of the things that are fundamental to being a woman. So just to give some examples of this, for a naturally cycling woman, which is what we'll call a woman who's not on the pill, right? Because she's naturally cycling between her two hormones. Hormones go through two different states across the state of a cycle. It starts off with hormone levels are really low when a woman gets her period, which is the first day of her cycle. And then estrogen levels begin to increase as her egg follicles are being stimulated. And as they're beginning to mature, that releases high levels of estrogen. And when estrogen increases, because it's nearing the time when women are able to conceive in the cycle, it causes a lot of biological, physiological, and psychological changes that make women primed for sex. Mm-hmm. So it makes women smell better to men. It makes women look more attractive to men because their skin becomes more vascularized, their cheeks become rosier. Mm-hmm. They just look more, they just look sexier. They smell sexier. They move sexier. Their voices are sexier. There's all of this research that's been showing that when estrogen levels are rising in the cycle, that it's associated with...
Strippers get more tips.
Strippers get more tips. Yeah, they earn more tip money. I mean, it's a real phenomenon. Mm-hmm. And this, this happens right as women are entering...
So why not flatten that? Why isn't that just annoying for women? And so they can replace that with a more regulated emotional life and one that's less unpredictable.
Right. But that's like equating normal and predictable with the male pattern.
Yeah, right.
And,
it's very
and
much
that's
like
not,
that.
And that's not true. It's like that's normal for males and predictable for males, but that's not true for women. That's not predictable for women. We're different entities. And I think that we've been in this cultural paradigm that equates normal with male for so long that we're even afraid to ask the question of, what if both of our hormonal states matter? Like, what if there's two halves to a woman's whole?
Don't you think it's okay? It seems to me that and maybe this is unfair, but it seems to me remarkably perverse that at least some of this can be laid at the feet of the feminists. Let's look at a couple of the strange things that we have as a consequence of the feminist world. We have the insistence that career is going to be the most important part of a woman's life. Now, the leftist feminists, and they're generally leftist, are anti-corporate, but they're pro-career. Okay, so that's very weird. To have a career is to be embedded in what the feminists object to as the patriarchy.
Right.
To subordinate your cyclicity to the hormonal rhythms of a man, you can't imagine something that would be more like subordination to the demands of the oppressive patriarchy, right? That kind of like sums it up. You're going to suppress the biological manifestations of femininity in favor of a persona that makes you optimally functional in the corporate patriarchy.
Right. No, so all of that, there's so many contradictions at the heart of that, right? Because another one is, we need to hire women in equal numbers as men because of the diversity that they bring to the workforce. But women are just like men.
Right. And we do everything we can to suppress their hormonal variation that would, in fact, make them different.
And you're right. A lot of the people who who really get nervous about talking about cyclicity and talking about hormonal changes are sort of the old guard feminists, where they I understand where all of that originated. Women, we've had a very bad history of being treated pretty poorly because of the fact that our hormones change. But it's like, I think that it's time that we need to move past that and say, all of this idea that there's something problematic about cycling hormones is assuming that there's only one way to be that's correct, and that way is male. Mm-hmm. And that's wrong. To me, it's like, I reject that. And yes, our hormones change, and you can say that they make us unpredictable, but it's actually incredibly predictable. Like, if you give me any woman, you bring her in off the street and put her here, and I ask her how old she is and when was the first day of her last menstrual cycle, I can tell you with pretty good certainty what her hormones are doing at that moment, right? If I bring a man in off the street, I have absolutely no idea what his primary sex hormone is doing because testosterone is reactive. It increases when there's a beautiful woman around. It decreases if your sports team loses. It increases if your sports team wins. Your political candidate loses, it decreases. So testosterone is incredibly reactive.
So that's also relevant to why the men would be hanging around the high status men. Because if your sports team wins, then your testosterone level,
testosterone,
right,
and you
right,
can go
right,
compete
right,
more.
right.
Yeah, no. So I mean, I a lot of these ideas that people have been using to reject the idea or object to the fact that that women they have cycles and that there's something problematic about that are all very much steeped in the idea that the male way of being is optimal, normal, and correct, and that the women, the female way of being is problematic. Right. And I absolutely reject that. And so when we take the birth control pill, what it does is instead of allowing you to cycle between these two hormones, because you start with this big increase in estrogen, which is coordinating all of the activities related to sex and conception, because this is the period in the cycle in which sex can lead to conception.
Mm-hmm.
And
how long a period is that?
It's about so that period of time is about 5 to 7 days. So about 5 days prior to ovulation, and then within 24 hours of ovulation, during that window, which we call the fertile window, sex can lead to conception.
And that's how many days a month?
It's about 5 to 7.
Yeah, right. Okay.
So, and then after ovulation, a little temporary endocrine structure forms from the empty egg follicle, and it begins releasing women's other primary sex hormone, which is progesterone. And when that hormone is being released, it tends to make us sleepier. It makes us hungrier. It makes us, it lowers our testosterone levels. It does a bunch of things physiologically that are helping prepare women's bodies for pregnancy, right? And prepare ourselves for the possibility that an egg might implant. Mm-hmm. And so women generally are less likely to be going out and doing risky things. They're more likely to avoid contaminants. So women's disgust sensitivity increases. There's all of these things that go on that are essentially preparing our body for this.
That's when they have maximal postcoital regret that.
I bet that that's so funny. Mm-hmm. And so you get this waxing and waning between these two hormones that are organizing our bodies for two different activities, implantation and conception, sex and conception, and then implantation and pregnancy. And we go in between these two states. And each of these hormonal states is associated with different types of psychological patterns and physiological patterns. I mean, even they've done studies where they scan women's brains every day across the cycle and take hormone measures. And it's like you see things like white matter density increasing when estrogen is high. Spinal, you get new dendritic spines in the hippocampus when estrogen is present. And then these things retreat when you're under the control of progesterone. And so we experience all these changes. Right. And that's a very normal part of being a woman. And when you take the birth control pill, what it does is you get a daily dose of a relatively low level of synthetic estradiol, so estrogen, and a relatively high level of synthetic progesterone, which is called a progestin because it's not biologically identical. And this mimics the state that a woman's body is in during that second half of the menstrual cycle when conception isn't possible. And what this does is it sends a signal to the hypothalamus not to stimulate the ovaries to produce a new egg because it's essentially waiting to see what happens with the one that was just ovulated. And so when you're taking the pill, you get the same daily dose every day of this synthetic hormonal state that's kind of keeping you.
So in principle, the body's reacting as if the woman has been sexually satiated in the most fundamental way. She might be pregnant.
Yes, she might be pregnant, essentially, is what that is saying.
And so one of the logical consequences of that correct me if I'm wrong, she should be less interested in sex.
Bingo.
But then this also ties into the change in her preference for men.
Yes.
So let's talk about that a little bit. Because, well, one of the things that really shocked me when I came across this probably 10, 15 years ago was that there was pronounced variability in the faces that women found attractive across the menstrual cycle. And so if you take photographs of the same man and you widen or narrow the jaw, widen jaws is a sign of more classically dominant. It's the wrong way of thinking about it. Competent, confident, masculine faces. You can do it with the same man. And the women who are in their most fertile periods prefer the wider jawed men.
Yes.
And so then I thought, this is a problem because it means that women who are on the pill prefer feminine men. Then I thought that's a real problem because it might be that women on the pill really don't like masculine men. That's probably a problem because we have a lot of tension between women and men in our society. And we have no idea how much that's driven by the fact that the pill is transforming the manner in which females perceive the most masculine men. I mean, it's a terrifying if that's the case.
Right. No, I mean, it's very provocative, right? That's the word I would use. It's incredibly provocative because what research has been showing now for about 20 years that when women are in the point in the cycle when estrogen is high, that's associated with an increased preference for testosterone cues, like you said. Vocal, facial, and behavioral masculinity are things that women are really zeroing in on right near high fertility in the cycle. And this, of course, begs the question, well, then what happens if a woman is on hormonal birth control and is never in the estrogen dominant phase of her cycle? Then what happens? And researchers have since asked that question. And what they tend to find is that women who are on hormonal birth control desire a somewhat less masculine male face and male voice. And there's been some research even showing that if women chose their partners when they're on hormonal birth control and then discontinue it, that this can lead to changes in how they perceive and how attracted they are to their partner.
Yeah, I read that, tell me if this is right, that if they picked an attractive partner, when they're off the pill, they find them even more attractive. But if they picked a less desirable partner, when they're off the pill, they find them even less desirable.
Bingo.
So it seems to, so that's
Bingo.
right. It magnifies the consequence of their choices.
Yeah, it's like all of a sudden the blinders were off. And so now they can, if they chose somebody who that they found attractive and because they weren't really paying that much attention to that or weren't prioritizing that when they were on the pill, all of a sudden the blinders are off. They see it, they love it, they're attracted to it, their relationship satisfaction goes up, their sexual desire in the relationship goes up. And if the opposite happens, it's the opposite. And we just...
So do women on the pill pick friends as mates?
Interesting. I've never seen a study looking at that, but I mean, it wouldn't be a far stretch to make that prediction just because it does seem like women who are choosing their partners on the pill, if there's a pattern that's found, the pattern is that women are generally zeroing in on qualities that have less to do with sexiness and sexual desire and masculinity, and more zeroing in on things like safety and is this
nurturance, companionship.
Yeah, exactly. And so
you can see that women have a very, very difficult choice to make, right? Because they want to pick a guy who can win a competition with other guys. Mm-hmm. They want to pick a guy who can keep the psychopaths at bay. Mm-hmm. They want to pick a guy who's productive. Mm-hmm. But they also need to pick someone who's generous and capable of forming responsible relationships. Well, talk about a play of opposites. And you can imagine that any shift in hormonal balance is going to skew that in one direction or another.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, for partner choice, I always tell my women in my class and also the men, the few men that are in my class, because it's a university and it's all women now. But what I tell them is it's all about making trade-offs, right? And sort of which side of the table you're stacking your coins. Are you stacking your coins more on the sort of sexiness, keeping the psychopaths at bay, kind of masculinity types of qualities? Or are you stacking your chips all the way over here of good caregiver, provider, going to help with the children? Are you putting them more toward the middle? Everybody makes a trade-off, and essentially what our hormones do is they kind of nudge where we put our stack. And what we can see when this happens en masse is you can see en masse changes in partner preferences potentially, which is, as noted, pretty provocative.
Well, we have no idea what the political consequences of that are.
Right.
Because you could also imagine, this is like the worst case scenario, imagine that there's a distribution of women who are affected by hormonal transformation. Mm-hmm. And some women are relatively unaffected, and some women are tremendously affected.
Right.
Well, you could imagine that the tremendously affected women would have more impetus to engage politically, right? So So imagine that there's a subset of women for whom the birth control pill makes masculine men particularly undesirable.
Right.
Now imagine that transforms itself into political motivation. Because it might. I'm not saying we know this. We don't know it because we don't know anything about the relationship between hormonal transformation and political activism. But the probability that there's no relationship is zero. Right. So we've thrown this new monkey wrench into the works in 1960 that's
Right.
transformed the relationship between men and women. And we really have no idea what the consequences of that are.
No, I was just talking to my class about this because I think it's really fascinating because I think culturally we've been feeling the tensions that are created by this for a very long time now. And again, I'm somebody, I feel very much like I benefited from the pill. I was on it for a decade. It was a great time in my life to be on it. It didn't cause me any problems that I'm aware of. I got to have my kids when I wanted to, got to invest and so on and so forth. But at the same time, having women have the opportunity to invest really heavily in their careers essentially sets up these expectations where women are supposed to be both women and men.
Yeah, right.
And so women now, it's like, because it's not either or. It's not like, oh, are you going to go to work, or are you going to stay home and take care of your kids? It's like, no, I'm doing both things.
Yeah.
And so we've set up this expectation where women are supposed to be women and men, and I think women's mental health is suffering hugely as a consequence of this. I think it's been very hard for women trying to balance everything, and with the expectation that they're supposed to be doing all of it.
Yeah.
But
it also begs the question of what's left over for the men.
Well, and this is what I think is really interesting. So this was the revelation I just had a couple days ago. I actually had it when I was teaching, and I told my students about it. And I'm like, I think I'm onto something with this. But testosterone levels are an absolute nadir right now. I mean, they're at an all-time low, and there's a lot of reasons.
Could that be a consequence of excess masturbation? Just out of curiosity?
I don't think so. No.
You don't?
No,
okay,
no,
why
no.
not? Because I thought
Masturbating,
it matches the increase in pornography use, say.
Yeah, no, I completely, yes, and that goes on concurrently, but testosterone
no, you don't
levels,
think so.
No, because usually when men are seeing a lot of attractive women, it makes their testosterone increase, and then that's not something that takes a major hit after masturbation.
Okay. So you think that's been put to rest? All right. So testosterone levels are at a low.
Testosterone levels are super low, and and there's a lot of reasons for this. We know there's a lot of xenoestrogens in the in the water, and that might be messing with their hormones. And men are heavier than they used to be, and fat aromatizes testosterone and turns it into estrogen, which also lowers men's testosterone levels.
Another advantage of an all-carb diet.
Yeah, but so here's another interesting thing, and I don't know if you know about this research, but it's really fascinating. So, culturally, we tend to think about testosterone as being this thing that is always good to have super high, right? We think it's masculinity and virility and protection, and but testosterone is, among other things, it's a hormone of mating effort, right? It's like effort that you're directing toward winning and doing things that are going to attract partners. It also it's linked with men's interest in extra pair partners and all of these other types of sort of counterproductive behaviors within the context of a long-term pair bond. And so what research finds is that when men get married or are in a long-term committed relationship, their testosterone levels decrease a little bit. And this happens absolutely functionally because it's essentially easing the foot off the gas pedal because it's keeping men from doing counterproductive things within the context of a pair bond. When men have young children,
Suppose it tilts them more to the. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Men have children. Their testosterone levels decrease again. And the more caregiving that men do, the more their testosterone lowers. And this isn't permanent. Right? This is a shift that men's bodies make in response to the environmental cues that's very adaptive and makes a whole lot of sense with our hunter-gatherer
they
history.
shouldn't be sexually attracted to the children, for example.
Yeah, well, exactly. They shouldn't be attracted to the children. And they also, if you've got young children at home who survival is dependent on you, you need to keep your eye on the ball and not on the next door neighbor.
Right. Absolutely.
And be raising your children. And so I started to think about this, and I was thinking about this idea that, women are being expected to be both women and men. Men are being expected to be both men and women because men are now doing more household work and more childcare than they ever have before. I think
which women also tend to find
levels,
not attractive.
Well, no, they do. It creates problems within the relationship because women lose sexual attraction in that context. But then men's testosterone levels could be decreasing in response to that. And that could be one of the factors that's contributing to men's low testosterone currently, is that we've created this case where women are having to be women and men are having to be men and women.
Right. And so what it does perversely for the men is that the men who are adopting the caregiver role more explicitly also put themselves in the terrible position where they're less sexually desirable.
Right,
I saw a very funny study at one point. It might have been David Buss, because he does funny studies all the time because he's still allowed to. I think what they showed university-age women, the same men engaging in male stereotyped activities and female stereotyped
Yeah.
activities, like vacuuming, for example.
Right.
God only knows why that's female stereotype, but has something to do with nesting, I suppose. And reliably, the women rated the men who were engaged in the more feminine activities as less sexually attractive.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that is such a, it creates this cruel bind. But I also think, it's funny. I teach a class called Evolution, Sex, and the Brain. And we ask big questions. So this is a class I really enjoy teaching because they encourage us to ask difficult questions that nobody really knows the answers to. And one of the questions I always ask them is about seduction. Because seduction is such an important part of women's sexuality. The idea of a man who has some sort of status and dominance, sort of being masculine, and women find that attractive and they find that sexual, that's sexually arousing. And there's this whole literature about the idea of one of the things that men do is sort of awaken women's sexuality.
Right.
That's
the kiss of the prince.
Well, yeah. And so then the idea that now we're in this environment where we say that we can't do that, right?
Yeah, right.
But it's also at the same time, it is important that women have exercise choice, right? And obviously, we don't want women getting sexually assaulted,
right?
And so it's how do we create a space, culturally, what is the conversation that we need to be having where it's seduction is okay, except that it's not.
Yeah.
It's really
You're
tricky.
definitely going to get fired. You're absolutely 100% going to. Well, I see one of the things that's so perverse about the modern university campus is, on the one hand, there's this absolute insistence that every possible form of sexual behavior is not only to be tolerated, but celebrated or even worshipped. And on the other hand, every single interaction between a young man and a young woman is so rife with danger that it has to be formulated into a contract before it can be undertaken.
Right.
Right. Well, you get, with that sort of absolute licentiousness, you're going to get a call for tyrannical regulation of sexual behavior because you can't have that much looseness without a demand for tightness. But it does beg the question that you're putting forward. And one of the answers to that, I would say, this is a sort of a sideways answer, is that alcohol is a very bad thing to pour into the mix.
Right. Yes.
Because it's the case that almost all sexual assault, especially the date rape types, but even the more violent types, almost all spousal abuse, all of that would disappear if alcohol disappeared. This is a conversation nobody will have about campuses, because part of the problem on campuses is that young men and young women who don't have that much experience with each other and who are also anxious as a consequence generally meet each other in alcohol-fueled bouts. And that's you can't say that alcohol causes violent crime, but you can damn near say it. 50% of people who are murdered are drunk. 50% of the murderers are drunk. The stats are even worse with regards to sexual assault. If without alcohol, without alcohol, it would almost never happen. So that's something that could be started as a topic of reasonable discussion on university campuses. Are there places where young men and young women can congregate and meet that aren't fueled by alcohol-induced stupidity and recklessness?
Right.
Now it's complicated because part of the reason that people drink is so that they can engage in alcohol-fueled stupidity.
Right.
Because it's fun. And one of the problems with the pill is that it actually allows that to occur without it being utterly catastrophic. Now, it's catastrophic in that the rate of sexual assault skyrockets, and that's, not trivial, but...
Right.
Yeah.